The ink was still wet on the napkin when I realized the woman smiling across from the city's most dangerous man was about to become his widow in exactly 3 minutes. My hand shook just enough to smear the blue ballpoint ink as I folded the vintage wine menu into quarters. The heavy cardstock felt like lead in my palm, a weight that could either save a soul or sink my own into the abyss. Around me, the Aura Lounge hummed with the muted frequency of untouchable wealth, the chime of crystal against porcelain, the soft laughter of people who never had to choose between a rent and medicine, and the whisper of silk against leather. Outside, the city rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, but in here it was suffocatingly warm. I approached table 5 like I was walking toward my own judgment. Darian Colfax sat with his back to the glass, a sharp-looking man with neck tattoos sitting in a throne of cold lights. He looked as if he were carved from stone, his fingers drumming a slow, predatory rhythm on the white linen. Beside him, Sorrel Ashby leaned in close, her red lips curving into a smile that looked like devotion. She looked like a woman in love. She wasn't. 15 minutes ago, I'd been in the staff locker room when the vibration of a burner phone stopped my heart. Through the locker slats, I watched Sorrel confirm his execution. She wasn't a high society sweetheart. She was a predator. I caught fragments of her voice, sharp, icy, and dropped into a dialect that sounded like razor wire. El vetro, in position. By the glass, in position. I should have let the clock run out. Darian's predatory business moves had cost my mother her life and my father his dignity. But as I stood over him, I realized that if I let him die, I was no different than the woman smiling at his side. Mercy isn't something you earn, it's something you give when it's least deserved. The wine bottle in my hand felt impossibly heavy as I reached the table. The locker room at the Aura Lounge was a cramped, neon-flickering sanctuary for the exhausted, smelling of industrial lavender and cheap cigarettes. I was reaching for my spare apron, my mind dull with the math of hospital bills and overdue rent, when the vibration started. It wasn't the rhythmic buzz of a modern smartphone, but the harsh, metallic rattle of a cheap burner phone. I looked down. The device sat on the wooden bench, its screen illuminating the dust motes with a cold blue glare. A single message sat on the display. "He's at the window. We're in position. Signal when the wine is poured." My heart didn't just race, it stopped. I knew who was at the window. Table 5. Darian Colfax. The man whose predatory real estate restructuring had liquidated my mother's small boutique and sent my father into a spiral of stress-induced strokes. To the city, he was a kingpin. To me, he was the architect of my family's ruin. Before I could move, the heavy door groaned open. I ducked behind the row of dented metal lockers, my breath hitching in my throat. Through the narrow slats, I watched a pair of designer heels, Sorrel Ashby's heels, click across the tile. She didn't look like the shimmering debutante I'd seen on the news. Her face was a mask of calculated stone. She picked up the phone, her thumb moving with lethal efficiency. I heard her voice then. It wasn't the melodic lilt she used for the cameras. She spoke in a dialect that sounded like glass shards hitting concrete. Russian. Then a sharp, commanding Italian. "Al vetro, in posizione," she whispered. "By the glass, in position." She typed a single word, "now," and dropped his phone back onto the bench. She paused for a second, checking her reflection in the cracked mirror, adjusting her silk dress until she looked like the perfect, loving fiancé again. When the door clicked shut behind her, I stepped out, my legs feeling like water. The Jonah in me screamed to stay hidden. Why should I risk my life for a man who didn't even know my name? A man who had stepped on my family like ants on a sidewalk. If he died tonight, it was just the universe balancing the scales. It was the justice I'd prayed for in the dark corners of hospital waiting rooms. But as I stared at that burner phone, a memory of my father's voice surfaced, a man who, even after losing everything, refused to carry the weight of hate. "Mercy isn't about who they are, Elsie," he used to say. "It's about who you are." If I stayed here and let the clock run out, I wasn't just a witness. I was an accomplice. I wouldn't be a victim of Darian Colfax anymore. I'd be just like Sorrel, a shadow waiting for a kill. I grabbed a vintage wine menu from the stack, my fingers trembling so hard I could barely hold the pen. I had to make a choice. I had to decide if the monster at table 5 was worth saving, or if I was ready to let my own soul go dark to watch him fall. I began to write, the ballpoint ink smearing against the heavy cardstock. They're in position. The transition from the cool, damp locker room to the suffocating opulence of the dining floor felt like crossing a battle line. I gripped the vintage wine menu so tightly the heavy cardstock began to bow under my thumb. My pulse was a frantic hammer against my ribs, echoing the ticking clock in my mind. Less than 2 minutes remained. Every step toward table 5 felt like a march toward a firing squad. Darian Colfax was exactly as I had seen him through the locker slats, a man carved from marble and malice, draped in a suit that cost more than my father's life-saving surgeries. He looked down at the table, his sharp jawline set in a mask of total, terrifying vulnerability. He was oblivious to the scope focused on the glass behind him, unaware that the woman sitting across from him was currently counting the seconds until his blood ruined the white linen. Sorrel Ashby's gaze snapped to mine the moment I breached the perimeter of their candlelight. Her eyes were wide, glittering with a suspicion that made my skin crawl. She clutched her phone, the same one that had signaled "now," and I saw her knuckles turn white. She was looking for a reason to discard me, to signal the gunman that the invisible waitress had seen too much. "The 2015 Bordeaux, sir," I managed to whisper, though my voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. I leaned in, my body shielding the movement from Sorrel's line of sight. As I set the menu down, I slid the smudged, quartered note from my palm onto the table, covering it with the edge of the leather-bound wine list. My hand shook visibly, the tremor so violent I feared the crystal glasses would shatter. Darian's hand paused. His fingers, marked with the dark ink of tattoos that climbed his neck, didn't reach for the wine. Instead, they shifted, pinning the note. He flicked his eyes upward, catching mine. In that heartbeat, the world narrowed to the space between us. I didn't look away. I didn't blink. I let him see the raw, jagged terror in my eyes. But it wasn't the shaking fear of a waitress caught in a mob war. It was the desperate, pleading anxiety of a human soul trying to pull another back from the edge of a cliff. Darian froze. He had spent a lifetime reading fear in others, fear of his power, fear of his violence, fear for their own lives. But what he saw in me was different. He saw a fear that was entirely, impossibly, for him. His predatory rhythm stopped. For the first time, the boss looked truly shaken, his unreadable mask cracking as he processed the note and the look in my eyes. "Is there a problem, Elsie?" Sorrel's voice cut through the silence like a blade, her smile never reaching her cold, watchful eyes. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just stepped back into the shadows, praying he had understood before the first dessert spoon hit the table. The glass didn't just break, it detonated. The floor-to-ceiling window behind table 5 disintegrated into 1,000,000 diamond shards, driven inward by a high-caliber round that whistled through the space Darian's head had occupied only a second before. He had moved, not because of the sound, which came later, but because of the note and the desperate warning in my eyes. The opulent silence of the Aura Lounge vanished, replaced by a symphony of screams and the rhythmic thud-thud of suppressed gunfire. Sorrel was already on her feet, her mask of devotion replaced by a snarl of frustration as she reached into her silk clutch. She wasn't looking for a phone anymore. "Move," Darian roared, lunging across the table, his hand, heavy and scarred, clamped around my wrist. It wasn't an arrest, it was a tether. He pulled me down just as a second shot tore through the leather upholstery of the booth. We didn't head for the front entrance, where his compromised security waited. Instead, he shoved me toward the service elevator. The world became a blur of stainless steel, the smell of burnt gunpowder, and the frantic descent into the bowels of the building. When the doors hissed open at the ground floor, we didn't emerge into a lobby of marble and gold, but into the rain-slicked filth of the back alley. The city I lived in was not the city Darian Colfax owned. He knew the penthouses, the boardrooms, and the fortified clubs. I knew the veins and arteries of the underground, the narrow passages where the trash piled up and the invisible people like me survived. "My car is 3 blocks north," Darian gasped, his suit jacket torn and stained with white plaster dust. He reached for a sleek, encrypted radio at his belt, but it remained silent. The betrayal was total. "The main roads will be crawled with them, Sorrel's people." "If you go north, you're dead," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline vibrating in my marrow. "They'll have the intersections staked out." I pointed toward a narrow, shadow-drenched gap between 2 crumbling brick warehouses, an opening so small a man in a Tom Ford suit would never have noticed it. "Through there. It leads to the old subway tunnels. The construction crews left the service grates unlocked." Darian hesitated, his dark eyes scanning the mouth of the alley. He was a man used to commanding armies, yet here he stood, bleeding from a glass cut on his cheek, forced to follow a waitress into the dark. He looked at me, the girl whose family he had crushed, the girl who had every reason to leave him to the wolves, and he saw no malice, only the grim determination of a guide. "Lead the way," he muttered, the words tasting like ash. We plunged into the shadow. The rain turned the soot on the ground into a slick slurry, and the smell of rot and damp concrete rose to meet us. Darian stumbled, his polished Italian shoes never designed for the uneven, cracked pavement of the forgotten city. I caught his arm, steadying the man who once thought he held the world in his palm. As we ducked behind a row of overflowing industrial bins, the headlights of a black SUV swept over the alley entrance. He pressed his back against the cold, wet brick, his chest heaving. For the first time, the king of the city looked like a stranger in his own kingdom. He was discovering that the streets he thought he owned actually belonged to the people he had spent a lifetime looking past. The safe house was a hollowed-out basement apartment beneath a laundromat, a place that smelled of damp concrete and industrial detergent. It was a far cry from the glass-walled penthouses Darian Colfax called home, but it was the only place the invisible people knew to go when the world above turned to fire. Darian sat on a rusted folding chair, the fluorescent light flickering overhead, making the jagged glass cut on his cheek look like a dark lightning bolt. He was breathing hard, his expensive suit ruined, his empire reduced to the 4 stained walls of a cellar. He reached into his inner breast pocket and pulled out a thick, leather-bound wallet. With trembling fingers, he produced a stack of high-denomination bills, the weight of the cash hitting the laminate table with a dull thud. It was more money than I had seen in a lifetime, more than enough to pay off the medical debts, the rent, and the lingering shadow of my mother's funeral costs. "Take it," Darian rasped, his voice cracking. "For the note, for the tunnels, for whatever this is." He pushed the money toward me, his eyes searching mine for the greed he was used to, the transactional glint he understood. He wanted this to be a business deal. If he paid me, he didn't have to owe me. If he paid me, he didn't have to face the fact that a girl he had stepped on had reached down to save him. I looked at the money, then back at the man who had authorized the predatory moves that broke my father's spirit. The bills looked like dirty paper. I didn't reach for them. I didn't even flinch. "I don't want your money, Darian," I said, my voice low and steady in the quiet of the basement. He frowned, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. You don't understand. This is enough to start over, to leave the city. I know who you are now. I remember the Rowan name. I know what my firm did to your family shop. Take the money. Consider the debt settled." "The debt isn't settled because of a few $1,000s," I replied, stepping closer until I was standing in the harsh light with him. "And I didn't save you because I wanted a payout. I saved you because I was told a long time ago that my debts were already paid by someone much higher than you." Darian recoiled as if I'd struck him. He looked at my hands, still stained with the ink of the warning note, and then back at my face. "What are you talking about?" "Mercy isn't a transaction," I said softly. "You think you're the one who owns this city, but you're just a man who's been trapped in his own cage of debts and vengeance. My father taught me that grace is a gift you give when someone deserves it least. That's why you're alive. Not for the money, for the chance to be something other than a monster." Darian's hand began to shake, not from the adrenaline of the chase, but from a profound internal tremor. He looked down at the cash on the table, and for the first time in his life, it looked worthless to him. He was a man who lived by the ledger of an eye for an eye, and I had just handed him a blank page. He slumped back against the chair, physically shaken by a power that his guns and gold could never touch. He realized then that I wasn't his victim anymore. I was his only hope for a soul. A small, battery-operated television sat atop a stack of detergent boxes in the corner of the safe house, its screen flickering with the blue-white light of a world Darian no longer belonged to. He sat in the shadows, his eyes fixed on the broadcast. Sorrel Ashby was center stage, standing before a thicket of microphones outside the precinct. She looked breathtaking, draped in a veil of black lace that made her skin look like porcelain. A single, perfect tear tracked down her cheek as she spoke about the tragic loss of her soulmate and the senseless violence that had stolen him from her side. Darian watched her performance with a cold, hollow fascination. He knew that look. It was the same one she had used when she whispered into his ear at table 5, just minutes before the glass shattered. To the cameras, she was the picture of a grieving fiancé. To him, she was a vulture circling a carcass she had helped create. "She's already moving on the assets," Darian murmured, his voice sounding like dry leaves. "The statement isn't for me. It's for the board, for the families. She's signaling that the throne is empty and she's the one holding the keys." He turned away from the screen, unable to stomach the choreographed sorrow. For years, he had operated under the assumption that loyalty was something you bought with diamonds and security. He had treated Sorrel like a crown jewel, and in return, she had treated him like a transaction, a stock to be traded when the dividends peaked. Their love was a contract, and she had found a way to litigate him out of existence. He looked over at Elsie, who was quietly folding a few clean rags she'd found in the dryer upstairs. She wasn't watching the news. She wasn't looking for a payout or a headline. She was just there, a woman who had every reason to wish him dead, yet she had risked a bullet to pull him into the dark. "She's playing the part well," Elsie said softly, not looking up from her work. "People believe what they want to see. They want to see a tragic romance. They don't want to see the truth behind the curtain." Darian stood up, his legs still heavy with the exhaustion of the flight. "I gave her everything. Power, protection, a name. And she sold it for a bigger share of a dying empire." He paused, his gaze falling on the stack of cash still sitting untouched on the laminate table. "And then there's you. I gave you nothing but grief, and you gave me my life." The realization hit him with more force than the assassin's bullet. In his world, everything had a price tag, a tit-for-tat that kept the gears of the syndicate turning. But Elsie's sacrifice didn't fit into his ledger. It was a gift, unearned, unbidden, and entirely free. Sorrel's love had been a velvet trap, but Elsie's mercy was a bridge. He walked toward the television and clicked it off, plunging the room into a heavy, thoughtful dimness. The image of the grieving fiancé faded into a single white dot before vanishing. Darian Colfax, the man who thought he owned the city, finally understood that he had been a pauper in a suit of gold. He looked at Elsie, and for the first time, he didn't see a waitress or a victim. He saw the only person who had ever truly seen him. Darian spent the next hour in the flickering dimness of the cellar. But he wasn't cleaning a weapon or checking the magazines of a handgun. Instead, he sat with a borrowed yellow legal pad, listening to Elsie describe the unseen world of the Aura Lounge. He had spent years studying the blueprints of buildings and the movement of security details, but Elsie gave him a different kind of map. The schedule of the service elevators, the blind spots of the kitchen cameras, and the specific codes used by the janitorial staff who Sorrel had undoubtedly overlooked. As he wrote, the transformation in Darian was visible. The predatory tension that usually defined his posture began to soften into a focused, quiet intensity. He realized that for the last decade, he had been fighting a war with hammers and fire, but Elsie was handed him a key made of light. Sorrel expected a monster to come roaring back for his throne with a trail of bodies behind him. She was prepared for a massacre, but she wasn't prepared for the truth. "I don't need my men," Darian said, his voice dropping into a register of calm conviction. "If I show up with a hit squad, I'm just proving her right. I'm just the beast she claims I am. But if I use the service entrance, if I move through the veins of the building the way you do, I can get to the server room before the gala begins." Elsie watched him, her eyes reflecting the blue glow of the small television. Sorrel thinks she's won because she has the guns, but she doesn't realize that the people she ignores are the ones who see everything. The burner phone, the texts, the security logs, it's all there in the digital shadows. Darian nodded, realizing that his old way of life was a suit of heavy iron that had only ever slowed him down. He didn't want the armor of shadow anymore. He wanted the armor of light that Elsie lived by, a way of moving through the world that relied on truth rather than terror. He began to plan a confrontation that bypassed the lobby guards and the snipers on the roof, targeting the one thing Sorrel couldn't kill with a bullet, her own trail of evidence. "You're going to help me," Darian said, not as a command, but as a request. He looked at the waitress who had saved his life, seeing her now as his most essential ally. Not to pull a trigger, but to open the doors they think are locked. "We aren't going there to take lives," Elsie. "We're going there to bring everything hidden into the light." He stood up and reached for a simple service jacket Elsie had found in the laundry room above. He put it over his ruined Tom Ford shirt, discarding the expensive silk tie like a snake shedding an old skin. As he stepped toward the door, he looked less like a mafia boss and more like a man on a mission of penance. He was no longer preparing for a hit. He was preparing for a revelation. The grand ballroom of the Colfax estate was a sea of curated grief, draped in black silk and lit by the flickering ghosts of 1,000 candles. Sorrel Ashby stood at the head of the banquet table, a glass of vintage champagne in her hand, her face a masterpiece of tragic composure, as she addressed the gathered heads of the city's most powerful families. She was midway through a toast to Darian's legacy, a legacy she was currently carving up like a carcass, when the heavy oak doors at the back of the room didn't burst open, but swung wide with a slow, deliberate weight. Darian Colfax walked into his own memorial service not as a ghost, and certainly not as the monster they expected. He wore a simple service jacket, his face clean of the plaster dust, but still marked by the jagged scar from the night the glass shattered. He didn't carry a weapon. His hands were empty, open, and visible. Beside him, Elsie moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had navigated the shadows of this house for years, holding a small digital tablet that was linked to the ballroom's massive projection screens. The room froze. Sorrel's glass shattered against the marble floor, the sound like a starter's pistol in the sudden, suffocating silence. Her face turned a ghostly ashen gray as Darian bypassed the armed guards, who stood paralyzed by the sight of a dead man walking. He didn't head for the head of the table. He stopped in the center of the room, under the harsh light of the main chandelier. "I didn't come back for my throne," Darian said, his voice echoing with a calm that left the room shaken. "I came back for the truth." With a nod to Elsa, the screens that usually displayed a slideshow of Darian's life flickered and changed. They didn't show photos of the past, they showed the present. The burner phone logs, the encrypted bank transfers Sorrel had authorized an hour after the hit, and the video from the locker room where she had whispered the order for his death. The evidence didn't just expose a murder plot, it exposed a systematic betrayal of every family sitting at that table. Sorrel had been selling them out to the feds to clear her own path to the top. Darian looked at Sorrel, who was now trembling with a rage that bordered on madness. "You thought my power came from my guns, Sorrel. You thought it came from the fear I sowed. But I learned from the very person I tried to destroy that true power is found in the things you can't buy." He turned to the gathered mob bosses, his gaze steady. "I'm not here to start a war. I'm here to end one. I am confessing to every crime, every predatory move, and every life I've stepped on. I am liquidating the Colfax Syndicate." The room erupted in a low, dangerous murmur, but Darian stood his ground, shielded not by steel, but by the absolute transparency of a man who no longer had anything to hide. He looked at Sorrel, not with hatred, but with a profound, quiet pity. He had exposed her greed not to save his empire, but to prove that the kingdom of fear was a house of cards. Behind him, Elsa watched the light hit the room, knowing that the banquet table had finally been cleared of its lies. Sorrel's mask didn't just crack, it shattered into a jagged, desperate madness. As the digital evidence of her treason played out for the silent Underworld titans, she realized the room had turned against her. The predatory loyalty she had relied on was a fickle thing, and now the very men she had tried to manipulate were looking at her as a liability to be erased. Screaming a curse that sounded like tearing metal, she lunged for a discarded handgun on the peripheral banquet table, her eyes fixed on Darian with a singular murderous intent. Darian was faster. He had spent a lifetime in the kinetic blur of violence, and before Sorrel could level the weapon, he had her pinned against the heavy mahogany of the head table, his hand clamped like a vice around her wrist. The gun clattered to the floor, sliding across the marble toward the feet of the other bosses. Darian's face was a mask of cold, ancient fury, the monster of Colfax resurfacing through one final act. His other hand went to the small of his back, drawing a suppressed pistol he had kept hidden in the service jacket, the muzzle pressing hard into the hollow of Sorrel's throat. The room held its breath. This was the conclusion everyone expected, the blood payment for the Judas kiss. Sorrel squeezed her eyes shut, her chest heaving against his, waiting for the spark. "Do it," she hissed, her voice trembling with a terrifying blend of fear and spite. "Show them you're still the beast, Darian. End it the way you always do." Darian's finger tightened on the trigger. The logic of his old world demanded it. Vengeance was the only currency he had ever known to settle a debt of this magnitude. But then he felt a hand on his shoulder. It wasn't the heavy grip of a bodyguard or the cold touch of a rival. It was the light, steady presence of Elsa. He didn't turn to look at her, but he could feel her gaze, the same intense, focused gaze that had seen through his power and into his soul in the locker room. She didn't say a word, but her presence was a physical weight against his rage. She was the living reminder that mercy isn't earned, and that if he pulled this trigger, he would be stepping back into the cage she had just pulled him out of. Darian's chest rose and fell in a ragged rhythm. He looked at Sorrel, not as a queen or a traitor, but as a woman imprisoned by the same greed that had once blinded him. Slowing his breathing, he lowered the gun. "No," Darian whispered, the word carrying more power than a gunshot. "That's not who I am anymore." He didn't look at the other bosses as he signaled for the doors to open once more. This time, it wasn't his men who entered. It was the authorities. Officers he had contacted through the channels Elsa provided, armed with the digital confession that would dismantle the syndicate from the inside out. "Vengeance is a debt that's never fully paid," Darian said, looking directly at Elsa as the police moved in to restrain a screaming Sorel. "But justice is a clean slate." He handed the weapon to the lead officer, choosing the cold, hard weight of the law over the fleeting heat of the bullet. As Sorel was led away in shadows, Darian stood in the light of the ballroom, finally free of the debt of blood. The liquidation of the Colfax estate didn't happen with a bang, but with the quiet, methodical scratch of pens on legal paper. The assets that had once funded a private army and a lifestyle of cold isolation were stripped away, converted into a community trust designed to rebuild the very neighborhoods Darian had spent a decade dismantling. The fortified penthouse was sold to fund a pediatric wing. The fleet of armored SUVs became a shuttle service for the elderly, and the predatory shell companies were dissolved into a foundation that provided interest-free loans to local families, like the Rowans. Darian watched the transformation from a small, rented apartment that smelled of cedar and rain, a world away from the sterile glass boxes of his former life. He was a man who had been hollowed out and filled back up with something far more durable than gold. The boss was dead, buried under the weight of his own public confession, and in his place was a man who moved through the city streets without a security detail, no longer fearing the shadows because he no longer cast one of terror. 6 months after the night the glass shattered at the Aura Lounge, the restaurant reopened under new management, stripped of its exclusive membership fees and turned into a space where the city finally breathed together. On a soft Tuesday evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Darian stood at the entrance. He wasn't wearing a Tom Ford suit or a predatory scowl. He wore a simple navy blazer and a look of quiet, settled peace. When the heavy glass doors slung open, he was the one holding them. He greeted the patrons, not with the nod of a king, but with the genuine smile of a man who finally knew the names of his neighbors. He saw the invisible people now, the waitresses, the busboys, the families struggling to make ends meet, and he saw them not as assets or obstacles, but as the heartbeat of a life he had almost missed. Elsa arrived just as the dinner rush began, her nursing scrubs a sharp contrast to the evening gown surrounding her. She stopped at the threshold, looking at Darian. The trimmer in his hands was gone, replaced by a steady strength. The foundation of his life had been shaken to its core, and on that wreckage they had built something that wouldn't crumble. "Table for one?" Darian asked, his voice warm and light. Elsa smiled, the same intense, focused gaze that had saved his life, now reflecting a future they were building side by side. "Actually, I'm here to help. I heard you needed someone who knows how to handle a rush." Darian laughed, a sound that was once foreign to his throat, and stepped aside to let her in, still holding the door wide. He had spent his life demanding to be served, only to find that the greatest power he would ever possess was the power to serve others. As the lounge hummed with the sound of laughter and the clinking of glasses, the man who once owned the city finally understood what it meant to belong to it.